Episode titles starting with the letter A to E. Episode titles starting with the letter F to J.
Episode titles starting with the letter K to O.
Episode titles starting with the letter P to T.
Episode titles starting with the letter U to Z.
Ring. You won't find Gustav Klimt's painting, Tree of Life, hanging in any museum. That's because it's actually painted on the dining room wall of a palace in Belgium.
The rocks floating around in space called asteroids aren't round. Most asteroids are shaped like ovals and dumbbells.
Being weightless in space isn't the only thing that happens to your body when there's no gravity. Astronauts actually grow a couple of inches taller while they're in space.
Composer Antonin Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 is also called the New World Symphony. Maybe that's why astronaut Neil Armstrong brought a recording of it into space for the first moon landing in 1969.
Gold and silver isn't just for jewelry. If you look closely at the painting Tree of Life, you'll see that Gustav Klimt used pieces of tin foil made of real gold and silver in his art. Saturn is one of the largest planets in the galaxy. But would you believe that it's also the lightest? That's because Saturn is mostly made up of gas. In fact, you can't stand on Saturn because there's no real surface to step on.
Even though Saturn's rings look like they're solid circles, a closer look shows that they're really made up of big and small chunks of ice floating around the planet.
Composer Antonin Dvorak didn't just love to write music. He was also a big fan of trains, and he spent hours and hours watching them come and go at the railroad station.
The Thar Desert is the 7th largest desert in the world, and while the temperature can be frigid in the winter, it gets hotter than 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer.
French painter Gustave Courbet taught himself to paint by studying the paintings of the masters hanging in the Louvre and trying to copy their work. Gustave Courbet is known as one of the fathers of European Impressionism, partly because of his paintings like The Wave, painted in 1869.
The Arabian Sea is part of the Indian Ocean, and in some places it is nearly 3 miles deep. This sea is full of fish like tuna, mackerel, and sardines. The Thar Desert is sometimes called the Great Indian Desert, and it covers nearly 20,000 square miles in India and Pakistan. That's almost as big as the state of West Virginia.
Hot air balloons may have been invented by human beings, but the first creatures to take flight in one in 1783 were animals, a sheep, a duck, and a rooster.
Peter Tchaikovsky was hired to write the music for Swan Lake by Russian director Vladimir Begachev, who paid him 800 rubles, about the same value as $550 today. Russian composer Peter Tchaikovsky not only wrote the music for Swan Lake, but he composed scores to the ballets The Sleeping Beauty and The Nutcracker as well.
If you see a group of wildebeests grazing when you're on a safari, don't make any loud noises. When wildebeests get startled, they can stampede, running together in a huge group at up to 50 miles an hour.
When Albrecht Dürer created his work of art, Rhinoceros, he had never even seen a rhino in real life. Dürer used a rough sketch and notes from people who had seen a rhinoceros to inspire his art.
Back.
When Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov played music, he didn't just hear notes, he also saw colors. Rimsky-Korsakov had a rare condition called synesthesia, where stimulating one of the five senses, like hearing, creates a response in another sense, like sight. What do giraffes and camels have in common? Well, they can both get by without having water to drink every day. Giraffes are able to live off the water they find in the green leaves they eat.
Giraffes aren't the only ones who eat food from the branches of trees. Elephants use their trunks to grab a hold of branches and shake food loose. If they're really hungry, they'll even pull the whole tree down. Is there such a thing as a wooden rhinoceros? There is when you're talking about Albrecht Dürer's rhinoceros. Instead of painting on canvas, Dürer used a technique called woodcutting, which means he engraved the rhinoceros into a piece of wood. Living in Africa can get pretty hot for hippos, which is why they spend most of their day hanging out in the water to stay cool. But for extra protection against the sun, would you believe they put on sunscreen? It's true. The skin of a hippopotamus sweats out a natural sunscreen.
Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov didn't only compose music for himself. He taught others how to do it too. One of his most famous students was Igor Stravinsky, who went on to become one of the most important composers of the 20th century. Back.
Pirate's Treasure.
Quincy and the Magic Instruments.
Rocket Safari. A tall totem tail.
Ring around Pirate's Treasure.
Georges Bizet wrote his first symphony when he was only 17 years old. But it's his opera, Carmen, that he's most famous for. Even though Carmen was written more than 100 years ago, you can still find it being performed all over the world today.
Paul Gauguin was born in France, but he eventually moved to the Tahitian Islands, where he painted the local scenery. While there, Gauguin built a cabin called House of Joy to live in on the island of Dominique. We know that waves end at the beach, but where do they begin? Waves build up in the middle of the ocean, where they form because of the wind. The size of a wave depends on how long the wind blows and how much open water it has blown across. Georges Bizet took piano lessons from his parents when he was very young, and he got to be so good that he was admitted to the Paris Conservatory to study music when he was only 10 years old.
So do real pirates use treasure maps? No. In fact, the idea of a treasure map where X marks the spot comes from Robert Louis Stevenson's famous book, Treasure Island. Back.